The Acolyte wasn't cancelled because of one reason. It wasn't just identity politics, it wasn't just fan backlash, and it wasn't just Disney's corporate strategy. It was all of those things colliding at once, layered on top of years of decisions that fractured the Star Wars fandom and diluted the brand. If you want to understand why the Acolyte failed, you have to look at the bigger picture, not just one piece of the puzzle. Leslie Headland gave an interview with The Wrap where she addressed the cancellation of the Acolyte. In that conversation, she pointed directly at racism and sexism within the Star Wars fandom as the reason the show failed. And let's be clear, those elements do exist. Star Wars has always had toxic corners of its fan base, and those voices can be loud, aggressive, and sometimes even organized. They've targeted actors, directors, and writers before, from Kelly Marie Tran during The Last Jedi to Moses Ingram during Obi-Wan Kenobi. So when Headland points to that toxicity, she's not inventing it. She's describing something real. But here's the problem. Reducing the failure of the Acolyte to toxic fan behavior alone ignores the larger structural issues that made the show vulnerable in the first place. Because the truth is, this show was fighting uphill from the moment it was announced. It wasn't just battling trolls on Twitter or YouTube commentators labeling it too woke. It was battling years of decisions by Disney that fractured the fandom, diluted the brand, and eroded trust. Identity politics may have been the spark, but the kindling had already been stacked long before. Think about how the conversation unfolded online. Commentators immediately seized on the idea that the Acolyte was too woke even for Disney. That phrase became a rallying cry, a shorthand for every frustration fans had with modern Star Wars. But when you peel back the layers, what does too woke really mean in this context? It's less about the show itself and more about the perception of Disney's broader creative direction. Fans saw diversity casting, new timelines, and unfamiliar characters, and instead of embracing them, they filtered those choices through years of skepticism. They remembered The Last Jedi being divisive, the Book of Boba Fett feeling unfocused, Obi-Wan Kenobi struggling with pacing. By the time the Acolyte arrived, the narrative was already set. This was another experiment in a franchise that no longer felt consistent. And here's where the identity politics debate becomes tricky. On one hand, yes, toxic fandom exists and it can sink projects by dominating the conversation. On the other hand, blaming toxicity alone risks oversimplifying the problem. Because if the Acolyte had been universally beloved, if it had captured the imagination of fans the way The Mandalorian Season 1 did, then the toxic voices wouldn't have been enough to cancel it. The show's failure wasn't just about who was yelling the loudest online. It was about the fact that the broader audience wasn't invested enough to drown those voices out. So when Headland points to racism and sexism, she's identifying one piece of the puzzle. But the bigger picture is that Disney created an environment where skepticism was the default. Fans weren't primed to embrace the Acolyte. They were primed to doubt it. And once that doubt took root, identity politics became the easiest explanation for why the show didn't connect. But the reality is more complicated. The Acolyte was a casualty of a franchise that had already lost its sense of magic. The Acolyte was set during the High Republic era, Disney's attempt to build a new continuity after decanonizing the expanded universe in 2014. And that decision wasn't just a corporate reset. It was a betrayal for millions of fans who had invested decades into stories that kept Star Wars alive between films. The expanded universe wasn't some obscure side project. It was the backbone of Star Wars for an entire generation. Think about what those stories meant. Heir to the Empire introduced Grand Admiral Thrawn, a villain so compelling that he became a fan favorite for decades. The Jedi Academy trilogy explored Luke rebuilding the Jedi Order. The new Jedi Order chronicled the galaxy's war against the Yuuzhan Vong, pushing Star Wars into darker, more complex territory. Legacy of the Force gives Jacen Solo's fall to the dark side, transforming into Darth Caedus, a storyline that rivaled Anakin Skywalker's tragedy in scope and emotional weight. These weren't just books, they were the continuation of the saga, the connective tissue that kept fans engaged long after the credits rolled on Return of the Jedi. And then overnight, Disney erased it all. Luke's son, Ben Skywalker, gone. Han and Leia's children, Jacen, Jaina, and Anakin Solo, gone. Decades of character development erased with a single press release. Fans weren't just losing stories, they were losing the future of Star Wars as they had imagined it. And here's the irony. Disney didn't even fully abandon the expanded universe, they borrowed from it. Palpatine's resurrection, The Rise of Skywalker, was lifted straight from Dark Empire, where he returned as a clone. Rogue One mirrored the first mission of Dark Forces, a video game where players stole the Death Star plans. Kylo Ren's design looks suspiciously like Darth Revan from Knights of the Old Republic. Even his name, Ben Solo, was taken from the EU, where Luke's son was named Ben Skywalker. Disney erased the EU, but then recycled its greatest hits, often without acknowledging the source. For longtime fans, that felt like salt in the wound. So when Disney asked audiences to embrace the High Republic, skepticism wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. Why trust a company that threw away decades of lore only to cherry pick from it later? The High Republic may have been ambitious, but it was built on shaky ground. Fans weren't ready to invest in new Jedi and new villains when the old ones had been discarded. And that skepticism carried over to the Acolyte. This is why the Acolyte was doomed from the start. It wasn't just about the show itself, it was about the context in which it existed. Fans remembered the betrayal of 2014, they remembered seeing their favorite characters erased, and they remembered Disney borrowing from the EU without credit. So when the Acolyte arrived, set in a continuity born from that decision, it was already fighting against a wall of distrust. And here's the key point. Distrust is harder to overcome than dislike. If fans dislike a character, you can win them back with good storytelling. But if fans distrust the company behind the character, every new project feels suspect. That's the environment the Acolyte walked into. And that's why blaming identity politics alone misses the bigger picture. The show wasn't just battling trolls, it was battling the ghost of the expanded universe. One of the biggest problems facing the Acolyte wasn't its story, its cast, or even its creative direction. It was the simple fact that Star Wars no longer feels special. Under George Lucas, Star Wars was treated like an event. After Return of the Jedi in 1983, fans waited 16 years before another mainline film arrived. That gap created anticipation, mystery, and reverence. When The Phantom Menace finally hit theaters in 1999, it wasn't just a movie release. It was a cultural moment. And even after the prequels, Lucas slowed things down again. Revenge of the Sith came out in 2005, and then fans waited a full decade before The Force Awakens in 2015. That's why the hype was so massive. Star Wars was rare, and rarity made it valuable. Disney changed that equation overnight. Instead of treating Star Wars like an event, they treated it like a content pipeline. The sequel trilogy arrived in rapid succession. Spin-offs like Rogue One and Solo filled the gaps. Disney Plus unleashed a flood of series. The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Andor, Ahsoka, Skeleton Crew, The Bad Batch, Tales of the Jedi, Visions, Tales of the Empire, Resistance. And that's not even all the projects are the ones still in development. The sheer volume of Star Wars content since 2015 has been staggering. But here's the problem. When everything is Star Wars, nothing is Star Wars. Oversaturation dilutes the brand. It erodes the sense of magic that made the franchise feel larger than life. Fans used to mark their calendars for the next Star Wars release. Now they scroll through Disney Plus and see a dozen options, many of which feel interchangeable. And when audiences are overwhelmed, they stop watching everything. They pick and choose. And when they pick and choose, shows like The Acolyte, already burdened by skepticism from the expanded universe fallout, get left behind. Think about how audiences consume media today. Fans only have so much time to give. If you flood them with content, they start rationing their attention. They'll watch The Mandalorian because it feels central. They'll watch Andor because critics praise it. But when a new show like The Acolyte comes along, set in an unfamiliar era, fans ask themselves, do I really need to watch this? And more often than not, the answer is no. This is where Disney misunderstood the psychology of its audience. Star Wars was never meant to be consumed like Marvel. Marvel thrived on interconnectedness, on the idea that every project builds toward the next crossover. But even Marvel is now struggling under the weight of its own interconnected universe. Following the MCU has started to feel like homework, with audiences overwhelmed by the sheer volume and complexity of storylines. Star Wars thrived on scarcity, on the idea that each story was a rare glimpse into a galaxy far, far away. By flooding the market, Disney stripped away that scarcity. They turned Star Wars into homework, and once something feels like homework, audiences stop showing up. That's why the Acolyte struggled. It wasn't just competing against toxic fandom or identity politics. It was competing against Star Wars fatigue, against the sense that the brand had been diluted beyond recognition, against the reality that audiences no longer felt compelled to watch every new installment. And when you combine that fatigue with the skepticism born from the expanded universe portrayal, you get a perfect storm. A show that might have thrived in a different era was instead drowned out by the noise of oversaturation. If you really want to understand why the Acolyte struggled, you can't ignore the absence of Star Wars video games in the Disney era. For decades, games weren't just side projects, they were essential to keeping the franchise alive between films. They gave fans a way to interact with the galaxy, to live inside it, to feel like they were part of the story. And when you take that away, you weaken the entire ecosystem that supports the brand. Think back to the early 2000s. Star Wars wasn't just something you watched, it was something you played. Republic Commando let you experience the Clone Wars from the perspective of elite soldiers. 2005's Battlefront 2 gave you massive battles across every era of the saga. Jedi Knight Jedi Academy let you wield a lightsaber and choose your path. Rogue Squadron put you in the cockpit of an X-Wing. Shadows of the Empire expanded the universe with new characters and storylines. And Bounty Hunter tied directly into Attack of the Clones, letting you step into Jango Fett's armor. These weren't just games, they were extensions of the films, bridges between installments that kept fans engaged year after year. Now compare that to the Disney era. After acquiring Lucasfilm, Disney largely abandoned console gaming. They had already pulled out of the video game market in 2010 after Tron Evolution, and that retreat left Star Wars gaming in limbo. Sure, we got Battlefront in 2015 and Battlefront 2 in 2017, but both were plagued by controversy, especially Battlefront 2 with its infamous loot box scandal. We got LEGO Star Wars The Force Awakens in 2016, which was fun but limited. And we got Jedi Fallen Order in 2020, which was excellent, but stood almost alone as a major console release. That's a thin lineup compared to the golden age of Star Wars gaming. And also don't forget about LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga, which is probably the footage I'm using right now, but even that game has a lot of its own problems. It's basically a LEGO game without it being a LEGO game. It's really hard to explain, but this is not a review of LEGO Star Wars The Skywalker Saga. Okay, here's why this matters for the Acolyte. Video games used to act as scaffolding for the franchise. They kept fans invested during the gaps between films and shows. They gave younger audiences an entry point. They created synergy. Watch Attack of the Clones, then play Bounty Hunter to explore Jango's backstory. Watch Revenge of the Sith, then play Battlefront 2 to relive the battles. And I'm talking the 2005 Battlefront 2, not the 2017 one, okay? That synergy is gone. Without games, fans lose one of the most interactive ways to stay connected. And when you remove that layer of engagement, every new show has to carry more weight on its own. Imagine if the Acolyte had launched alongside a major console game set in the High Republic. Imagine if fans could play as Jedi from that era, explore the lore, and build familiarity with the setting before the show even premiered. That kind of synergy could have softened skepticism, given fans a reason to care, and created momentum. Instead, the Acolyte arrived in isolation, with no gaming support to expand its reach. This is why the video game void matters. It's not just about missing out on fun titles. It's about losing an entire ecosystem of engagement. Disney underestimated how much games matter to the health of the franchise, and without them, shows like The Acolyte were left exposed, forced to succeed without the scaffolding that once made Star Wars feel alive across every medium. By the time The Acolyte premiered, it wasn't just another Star Wars show. It was a test case for whether Disney could still make Star Wars feel essential. And the truth is, the deck was stacked against it from the start. The expanded universe portrayal had already fractured trust. The The oversaturation of content had already diluted the brand. The absence of video games had already weakened the ecosystem. And then, on top of all of that, identity politics became the lightning rod for online discourse. But here's where the bigger picture becomes even clearer. The Acolyte wasn't alone in its struggle. Take Skeleton Crew, for example. Created by John Watts and Christopher Ford, starring Jude Law, the series was praised by critics for its nostalgic Amblin-style storytelling, essentially the Goonies in space. Rotten Tomatoes gave it a strong 92% average score, and fans who did watch it often described it as one of the freshest Star Wars projects since Andor. Yet, despite the praise, Skeleton Crew premiered with the lowest viewership of any Star Wars show on Disney+, logging less than 382 million minutes watched in its debut week. That's lower than The Acolyte, which itself was considered a flop. And here's the key point. Skeleton Crew wasn't dominated by get woke go broke narratives. It wasn't divisive in the way The Acolyte was. It didn't suffer from the same identity politics discourse. Instead, it was largely ignored. That tells us something important. The problem isn't just about politics or fan toxicity. The problem is that audiences are tuning out Star Wars altogether. Even when the product is good, even when critics are supportive, the brand fatigue and fractured trust are so deep that people simply don't show up. This is why focusing only on one factor, whether it's too woke or toxic fandom, misses the larger reality. The Acolyte was a casualty of a franchise that had lost its sense of magic, but so was Skeleton Crew. One was divisive, the other was praised, yet both were ignored. That's the bigger picture. Disney has created an environment where even quality projects can't break through. Think about how audiences respond to franchises today. Marvel fatigue is real. The Walking Dead collapsed under the weight of too many spin-offs. Even Game of Thrones saw its cultural dominance evaporate after a divisive final season. Oversaturation, fractured trust, and fatigue aren't unique to Star Wars, but they hit Star Wars harder because of what the franchise used to represent. Star Wars wasn't just another brand. It was a myth. It was an event. It was rare. And when you strip away that rarity, you strip away the magic. That's why The Acolyte and Skeleton Crew matter. They're not just canceled or ignored shows. They're symptoms of a larger disease within Disney's handling of Star Wars. They prove that you can't erase decades of lore, flood the market with content, abandon key mediums like gaming, and then expect audiences to show up out of loyalty alone. Loyalty has limits, and once those limits are crossed, even the most ambitious or most praised projects are destined to fail. In the end, The Acolyte wasn't canceled because of one controversy or one creative choice. It was canceled because Disney's stewardship of Star Wars has been defined by fractured trust, oversaturation, and a weakened ecosystem. Identity politics may have been a flashpoint, but it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The deeper issue is that Star Wars no longer feels rare, no longer feels magical, and no longer commands the kind of loyalty that once made every release an event. The expanded universe betrayal left fans skeptical of any new continuity. The flood of Disney Plus shows diluted the brand to the point where audiences stopped feeling compelled to watch everything. The retreat from console gaming removed one of the most interactive gateways into the galaxy, and when The Acolyte arrived, it was already burdened by all of those decisions. Toxic fandoms may have amplified the noise, but the sounds of disengaged fans was louder. And this isn't just about The Acolyte. Look at Skeleton Crew. That show wasn't divisive. It wasn't dominated by get woke go broke narratives. Critics praised it, audiences who watched it enjoyed it, and yet it premiered with the lowest viewership of any Star Wars show on Disney+. That proves the problem isn't just politics or controversy, it's disengagement. Even good projects are being ignored because audiences no longer feel the need to keep up. So when we talk about The Acolyte, we shouldn't just frame it as a casualty of identity politics. We should frame it as a symptom of a larger disease within Disney's handling of Star Wars. Because until the franchise regains its sense of rarity, its sense of magic, and its ability to feel essential, no amount of creative ambition will be enough. And that's the real lesson of The Acolyte and of Skeleton Crew.